All right. Do not judge. Whenever I'm working through a particular book of the Bible, there's usually a number of different commentaries to choose from. Some standalone commentaries, others in a series, all kind of by a variety of different authors. And depending on what book I'm in, there's a variety of how many different commentaries there are to choose from, right? There's lots of commentaries written on Paul's letter to the Romans. There's comparatively fewer on the book of Nahum. But there is no shortage of commentary on do not judge. For instance, one was written in 1962 by the renowned theologian Bob Marley. Marley says, "Don't you look at me so smug and say I'm going bad. Who are you to judge me and the life I live? I know that I'm not perfect, and I don't claim to be, so before you point your fingers, be sure your hands are clean. The road of life is rocking, and you may stumble too, so while you talk about me, someone else is judging you." Gandhi offers his own version, saying, "Do not judge others, be your own judge, and you will be truly happy." Nietzsche argued that judge not is in itself its own judgment, and therefore inherently hypocritical, supporting his conclusion that the Gospels are an exercise in psychological coercion and morality is just a fraudulent guise for misleading humanity by a hook in its nose. Or perhaps you who kind of consider yourselves more intellectual, you will kind of prefer this commentary clearly from a highly academic source that I stumbled across in the great sanctuary for all cerebral and scholastic endeavors called the internet, that reads this: "Judge not, lest ye be judged. Yes, 5 S's, 4 exclamation points. Judging others, sorry, boo. No one is above anyone else, not even you. Mr. Perfect doesn't exist. Telling God we can do his job better? Nope. Smote, cloud emoji. Smote, lightning emoji. Smote, meteor emoji. Smote, fire emoji. If you are judging, you aren't working on self or looking at yourself in love. Just love." All caps, 12 heart emojis. "Love can cover a multitude of your own sins. We are all a beautiful work in progress. The awesome news," this is a gospel claim, the good news, the awesome news, "no one else has the right to judge us either. Stop worrying what others think and go out there and have an amazingly fun adventure. Be someone that makes you and God happy. Live, laugh, love. Not just a saying, a way of life." Close quote. Judge not, lest ye be judged. One of the most quoted, perhaps the most misquoted verse in the Bible. And the irony is that it seems like this is maybe most often quoted by people who neither understand what Jesus teaches, believe who Jesus is, care what Jesus says, or submit to Jesus' authority. Despite that reality, the great tragedy is that it seems like many who call themselves Christians still allow the general public to be their interpretive guides to this passage. While Jesus teaches his disciples to show mercy, the words get weaponized and used to silence any criticism that comes our way. How backwards is that? Jesus tells us that we must be careful, what we must be careful not to do to others, and we apply it as what others better not do to me. But here we are at these very familiar and yet probably not familiar enough words. So this time, let's take our cues, what it means from the word, rather than allowing those who oppose Jesus to inform its meaning. We really can't understand what Jesus is teaching here without the material that comes before this. This is getting closer to the conclusion of Jesus' sermon. And here's what the shape of Jesus' sermon has been so far. He said, "Blessed are those who are disadvantaged now, because they have hope in the kingdom to come." We talked about this a few weeks ago. And then he says, take that a step further. Not only blessed are those who are disadvantaged now, I say to you, even disadvantaging yourself for your enemies and those who mistreat you will be blessed. Because God did. Therefore, you be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. This is where we just finished last week. What does that look like, to be merciful? like our Father in heaven is merciful. Well, that's this section. That's the section that Bev just read for us. This is Jesus's application of that command. Be merciful. What does it look like to be merciful? Don't judge or condemn. Instead, forgive and give. Jesus uses a 4-part repetition here. 2 positive, 2 negative. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. The point in the repetition here is not to distinguish what separates one of these things from the next. In other words, like, we shouldn't be sitting here asking the question, okay, don't judge, kind of check. And then also don't condemn. Okay, now what is different between judging and condemning? Let's kind of nuance that out. That's not the point. The repetition is serving not to show the distinction between each of these things, but actually to show their continuity, to show what's the same. What do not judging and not condemning, what do forgiving and giving have in common? They are merciful. These are acts of mercy and kindness and patience. That's what they have in common, which is the principle that Jesus is applying. Be merciful like your Father is merciful. This is the principle. It's worth noting here, early on as we get into these verses, that it is not discernment that's being forgiven here. This is not the outlawing of legitimate exercise of judgment and discipline. We know that because all through the scriptures, God gives us parameters around what sort of judgments we are to make, what sort of judgments are required, how we are to make them, when we are to make them. The civil governing authorities are mandated to establish courts of law by which right and wrong can be tried and judged. Paul writes to the church in Corinth, passing a judgment on a given situation and instructing them how to kind of carry out that proper sentence. Adjudication is not an evil that's being decried here. Rather, what Jesus is forbidding, what he's forbidding us from, what he's keeping us from, is seeking to look better by criticizing others as worse. This becomes clear as the sermon continues. Jesus kind of gives the principle here. Be merciful. And then he applies that principle. Don't judge or condemn, but give and forgive. And then he illustrates the principle 3 times. And especially by the 3rd illustration, it becomes clear what he's referring to. Because the culture at this time is ripe with Phariseeism. This is kind of how the Pharisees operated. The demonstration of their piety was often accomplished by the degradation of others, right? That's how you show that you're righteous, by pointing out the unrighteousness of those around you. Think about the parable that Jesus tells when the Pharisee and the sinner go to the public square to pray together. What does the Pharisee's prayer sounds like? His prayer for all the world to hear is, Lord, thank you that I am not like that guy. Right? He's kind of defined by being unlike that guy's sin. Now, before you say, oh yeah, that was definitely the problem with the Pharisees. Are we any different? Isn't an easy way to make sure that you're not the butt of the joke just to start making fun of someone else first? There's a popular sitcom where in one episode, the kind of office klutz is retiring. And when everyone realizes he's leaving, they're like, oh man, now we're not going to have anyone to make fun of. And the kind of like wiser, sage supervisor says, I have been in many of workplaces. When one leaves, the workplace simply selects a new one. It's the natural order of things. And then everyone starts kind of trying to watch for each other to do something stupid so that they all can pile on and make fun of that person. Why? Because if they can pick on someone else, then they won't be the one who's now selected as the new office joke. They won't be the one who's being picked on. Don't we do that kind of thing? Even in a more serious sense, beyond kind of just like teasing and banter. Have you ever pointed out someone else's error for the purpose of hoping that others would see that you don't, in fact, make that error? Or that they would just assume by the fact that you can identify it and that you can point it out, that it must mean that you're maybe a little bit further along in that area? I feel like the world around us is kind of built on this. Cancel culture thrives on this. Cancel others before you get canceled. It's the only way to survive. But point out where they've transgressed the accepted social boundary so that you can maintain your standing within it. I saw a family member make a post on social media one time, and it was, guys, this had to be the most carefully crafted and intentionally worded post I have seen. It was a work of art. Like making sure to use every inclusive term in the book and give every recognition and every apology to kind of acknowledge their own privileges and biases and kind of defer respect and honor on every marginalized group imaginable. It was a masterpiece. I was reading it, like I was exhausted just reading it, thinking, I don't think I would have enough time to say anything if I had to say everything that I said like this. Quite a remarkable feat to even be able to kind of like put that together and check all of those boxes in the time that you have to sit down and tweet something. And the very first comment on the post reads, "Oh, wow, I hate to be the one to tell you this, but you misspelled one of the terms, and that is just really highly offensive." You put ED on the end, and the preferred spelling is now ER on the end. I'm sure that you weren't trying to be insensitive and hurtful, but I just wanted to make sure to spread this awareness to you so that you can better yourself. And if anyone from that community read this post and has been triggered by this careless spelling, I want you to know that I see your pain. That is textbook Pharisee move. Don't do that. If someone, and we have our own ways of doing this. If someone tells you that they've been struggling recently and you ask, well, how's your prayer life been? When yours has been subpar recently, just because you like the idea of others hearing you ask and thinking, oh, wow, they thought to ask about their prayer life. Theirs must be great. Don't do that. If you're quick to assume guilt because you just kind of know how they are, you know their type, don't do that. That is in no way merciful like your Father is merciful. If you're likely to give advice or share instructions with others, not because you have any idea what you're talking about, because if you do, because you're thinking, hey, maybe if I share advice, I will come across as if I know what I'm talking about. Don't do that. Jesus doesn't say, fake it till you make it, exude confidence, and you're already 90% of the way there. Here's the reality. Other people are not a prop for you to use in crafting your image. Other people are to be the recipients of your mercy because both you and they are the recipients of your Father's mercy. So what are we to do? What does it look like to be Jesus's mercy-showing people? Well, Jesus tells us, he illustrates it. He gives us 3 different word pictures as he fleshes out this idea of trading in judgment and condemnation for mercy. His first illustration, good measures. Give, and it will be given to you, a good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over will be poured into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. What does Jesus mean by a good measure? Well, the illustration here would be of buying something in the market, some kind of item or substance that's being purchased by volume. So let's say someone came to you to buy grain, right? They're purchasing 1 measure of grain. You take that grain and you pour it into some kind of measuring container. Now, if you're greedy and you're unscrupulous, you can find a way to kind of like make the measuring container look bigger on the outside, but actually smaller on the inside so that you can sell less for more. But even if you aren't that underhanded, if you're just kind of a little bit lazy and careless, you can just kind of pour the grain into the container, pour the container into the fold of the customer's garment that they kind of make to carry what they just purchased and call it a day. That is not what Jesus wants of his people. He says to give a good measure, and a good measure will be given to you. What is a good measure? A good measure is one that's poured into the container and then it's pressed down to make sure that it completely fills in the space. And then you know what? For extra care, let's shake the container a little bit. to make sure that the grain settles into every nook and cranny of that measuring container. And let's top off the container again. And let's top it off so that the measuring container is running over. Like fries at Five Guys. Right? Like, don't just measure them into the cup. Throw an extra scoop into the bag, too. This is the first illustration. Do you live like that? Do you give like that? Do you forgive like that? Pressed down, shaken together, and running over? Do you scoop up benefit of the doubt the way Five Guys scoops up fries and throw a little extra into the bag? Christian, how easily are you irritated? How hard is it to make you frustrated? What does it take to elicit criticism from you? Does it take a lot? Christian, do you remember the gospel? Christ the Lord bore your sins in his body on the tree. Every sin that you ever committed, every guilty act that you ever enacted, every single thing that you have every reason to be judged and condemned for, Jesus took them. He took all the pain and the suffering that came with them. He carried the weight of them on his shoulders. He had their nails driven through his hands. He had the crown of their thorns pressed down onto his head. He suffered the anguish and died the death of your things, of your judgeable, condemnable things. With everything that you have been forgiven, shouldn't you be the most patient person on the planet? How little does it take to get you irritated? With how much you've been forgiven, you should be the most patient person on the planet. And I'm saying you right now because I mean it. You, individually, should be the most patient person on the planet. When I'm saying you, I mean me too. I mean us. But I don't want you to not feel the weight of what this means for you personally. The Apostle Paul called himself the chief of sinners. That should be the attitude of all Christians. I have been forgiven more than anyone else that walked this earth. No one had a greater debt of sin than I, and Christ canceled it. Let there be no one more merciful. Let there be no one quicker to forgive. Let there be no one slower to judgment than I, who most of all have been forgiven. If we were honest, I don't think most of us look around the room that way. I think we look around the room and think, I, of all people, deserve to be shown some mercy. With everything I've done, with all that I've been through, considering how hard I try, I should be given a little slack. People should take some notice. Because if you looked around this room right now and honestly, you remembered and believed the gospel, your first thought would be, no one has more reason to extend grace than me. If that was true of you, your first thought would be, what could I not suffer and endure and persevere in with one another? If that was true of us, we would be able to bear just about anything from one another with forgiveness and patience in our heart. You have been given a good measure. Give a good measure. Your brothers and sisters shouldn't have to wonder if they can count on your patience and forbearance. You should be overflowing with a measure of patience and forbearance. This is an area that I fall short, and I have to confess. I far too often think of myself as being very patient with my kids and with my wife. Not patient enough. Not nearly patient enough. Lord, forgive me for ever congratulating myself on exhibiting patience as if it were somehow going above and beyond what was required of me. If my patience could be measured like fries, my family should have bag fries for days from me. For such was the patience and mercy shown me at the cross. Jesus' second illustration, blind guides. The second illustration Jesus uses is of blind guides. He asks two rhetorical questions. Just based on the grammar alone, the first of these assumes an answer of no, and the second one assumes yes, but you can probably figure that out just from the context of the question. Can the blind lead the blind? Well, no. Won't they both fall into a pit? Yes, obviously. Have you ever made the mistake of leaving your driveway thinking that you scraped enough of the ice off of the windshield that you'll probably be fine to see? I do this all the time, and still, like an idiot, I keep doing it even though it just never works. I scrape most of it off really quickly, but there's still some of those little ice crystals that kind of form like some kind of flower-like shape around the edges. But I can see through them, and I can kind of see around them. It's no big deal until I start heading down the road towards Portland in the morning time and the sun is rising in the east, as it seems so stubbornly to always insist on doing. And what happens when the sun is right in front of you and the light hits those little crystals on the glass? The whole windshield just like lights up. You can't see anything. It's just kind of like one bright glare all the way across your car. If you were in that situation, you probably shouldn't be leading a convoy. That happened to my brother when he was driving one time. He decided it was kind of unsafe to continue because he couldn't see anymore. So he was going to pull off the road until it was safer to drive, and he pulled off right into a mailbox. Jesus asked, can the blind lead the blind? Won't they both just drive right into a mailbox? What's Jesus' point here? His point is that a disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone who's fully trained will be like his teacher. If you're going to help lead others, you have to become merciful like Jesus. If you lead them right now, you will just be leading them into a pit. First, you need to lose your own blindness to be made more like Christ. It's not merciful to have others following you if you haven't learned to follow the mercy of Christ. Now, this isn't requiring perfection. Again, with these verses, the temptation is always to kind of actually flip what Jesus is saying and use it as a club. To say, oh, you think you can lead me, so you think you're perfect like Jesus, huh? Now, is that it? That's not the point. Again, Paul called himself the chief of sinners. He planted churches. He led Timothy and Titus. He wrote instructions. He made judgments. He confidently taught, exhorted, rebuked. He didn't achieve perfection in order to be qualified to do these things. It's not hypocritical for me to preach these things to you, having not perfected them myself. It would be hypocritical of me if I was preaching these things and ignoring the need to be humbly conformed to Christ. I do have to know that the measure I use and give to you will be measured back to me. But perfection isn't the prerequisite. We don't stop making discernments. We don't stop providing instruction and correction. We can't stop leading. But we better stop doing so in any manner apart from Christ-likeness. If we're going to make discernments, if we're going to make judgments, if we're going to lead, which we must do, then we have to do it in Christ-likeness. We have to do it while becoming more like our Master. Why? I think the third illustration helps us with that. Let's read verse 41 and 42 again. Why do you look at the splinter in your brother's eye, but don't notice the beam of wood in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, brother, let me take out the splinter that is in your eye, when you yourself don't see the beam of wood that's in your own? Hypocrite! First take the beam of wood out of your eye, and then you'll see clearly to be able to take out the splinter in your brother's eye. This is probably the most well-remembered of these three illustrations. If you don't remember it as splinters and beams, maybe you know them as specks and logs. But again, the way that I have most heard this illustration applied is people saying, stop worrying about the speck in my eye. Get the log out of your own. That is the opposite application. Concluding that yours is a speck and theirs is a log is just as much ignoring the log in your own eye as what you're accusing them of. Remember, this is about how you treat others, not about how you demand to be treated. Jesus again illustrates, why do you look at the splinter in your brother's eye, but don't notice the beam of wood in your own? Isn't that a very accurate description of being judgmental? Isn't it so often accompanied by a lack of self-awareness? Where there's kind of like one person in the friend group who's like, guys, so-and-so is just so sensitive and about anything. Like, and they take everything as a criticism and they're super defensive. Like, am I right? Everyone else in the friend group is kind of looking around at each other thinking like, no, that's you. Like, you're the one that we all feel that way about. That's really what judging does. It ends up revealing your own shortcomings. When I worked at a pediatrics office where we used to live, I told my supervisor one time, I think I've identified a pretty foolproof interviewing hack. Dave Tonen's probably already figured this out. This supervisor and she and I used to always sit in on a lot of job interviews together. But I said, if anyone in an interview ever mentions how much they dislike workplace drama, I'm just not going to hire them. Because they will be the most sensitive and dramatic and problematic team members that you will have. I said it a little bit kind of tongue in cheek, but there is something true about that. This really kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier. How often is that flaw that we like to point out simply a diversion to make others think that we excel in that area? Our own self-deception makes us think that we're qualified doctors when we are really certified patients. When I was in seminary, I worked as a delivery driver for a pharmacy. One of my regular routes was to this assisted living facility in town. And I had this one customer who lived there who was like, I'm just going to be real. She was a very mean, cantankerous old lady. I tried to cut her a lot of slack because I don't know, maybe she didn't have a whole lot of family that visited her and she was just lonely. But every time that I visited her, there was one thing that she complained to me about without fail. She would kind of take her little bag of medicine and she would have this angry scowl on her little face and she would kind of like gesture for me to come in close. And every single time I was there, she would say, I hate being around all these old people. They're so old and wrinkly and saggy and they just look like they could die any day. And I just can't stand people who are close to dying. They're so gross. I'm like, do they have mirrors here? It is so easy to see the faults around us. My kids are really good at diagnosing bad behavior and identifying what's problematic about their actions. There's only one question you have to ask them, and you will just unlock really kind of like genius psychologists. All you have to do is say, can you tell me what your brother did wrong? Like, they know. I mean, they're right too. They're spot on. They've got the motivations. They know where their brother went wrong. They know really what he needs to do to make it right. If you ask them what they did wrong, they're like, I don't even know where I would begin to try to figure that out. It's like the question just doesn't really compute. I don't think any of us would argue that this is a common human problem. The ability to see splinters in others and a difficulty wrecking beams in ourselves. So what's the solution? Interestingly, the solution is actually the opposite of how most people want to apply these verses. The solution is a community of faithful brothers and sisters who can lovingly point out your beams and your splinters. The common interpretation of this passage is, watch it, beam face. Your splinters have splinters. Don't come talking about mine. That's not what Jesus is teaching. If you have a hard time seeing the beam of wood in your own eye, how do you expect to get it out? How do you expect to identify it? You need others to help. When you're struggling, you need a friend to gently ask you, how has your prayer life been? Don't go ask that question to your brother to make yourself look spiritual. Instead, first go devote yourself to the reading of the word and to prayer, so that when your brother is hurting, you might extend a helping hand of mercy and ask, brother, how has your prayer life been? Look what Jesus says. The conclusion that Jesus draws, the instruction he gives. It's not, ignore your brother's speck. Doesn't really concern you or need to be removed all that much. Not making a big deal out of it. He says, take the beam out of your own so that you can help. Then you will see clearly to take the splinter in your brother's eye. Then you'll be like your teacher. You'll be ready and you'll be prepared to be merciful. The splinters in the beams need to be removed. Remove the beam to be able to help with the splinters. How can we apply this? Because the answer isn't mind your own business and stay in your lane. But one way that you can apply this, if you haven't already, is actually sit down with a number of brothers and sisters that you trust and say, listen, I want to invite you to please point out to me any beams or splinters that you notice. Now, spoiler alert, that's really what church membership is. Yeah. When you signed the church covenant, when you covenant together in church membership, you're asking a family of people to do just that, to keep watch over your life and doctrine. But we live in a very conflict-averse society. We're always afraid to offend. We'd rather just kind of say nothing than risk rock the boat. So your brothers and sisters might need your help. They might need you to help them help you by giving them a very clear and explicit invitation and request to regularly examine you. Any chance that I get to brag on you guys, either to kind of others outside of our church or to one another, I love to do it. So I'm going to use this opportunity to commend to you someone in our body who does an exceptionally good job of this. And she's downstairs teaching kids, so I get to embarrass her. Rebecca Perkle. I remember a time, it's probably maybe been about 2 years now, when Rebecca came to me and she said, hey, I just wanted to tell you to be like really abundantly clear that I very much want to be pastored. I've realized that I have some blind spots and I don't want to just stay that way. So if you hear or notice anything in what I'm saying or what I'm doing or how I'm kind of going about things, I just want you to know that I really want you to correct me on them. And that is just a massive evidence of God's grace in someone's life. Especially because, as Rebecca would be the first one to tell you, that kind of thing does not come naturally to her. Rebecca's natural inclination would be to say something more like, hey, I just wanted to tell you, you're not the boss of me. If you had asked me when I first started getting to know Rebecca as my potential future sister-in-law, if that conversation would ever happen, I would have not given you very good betting odds. But when disciples are made more like their master, those are the things that can happen. When we are made more like Jesus, our natural inclinations are replaced by humility, and that humility is the necessary softening agent to make the removal of splinters possible. And to be completely honest with you, that conversation with Rebecca and all of the many times since that she has come to me in various situations and said, hey, I just need you to check my thoughts and my motivations here, has been one of the greatest joys and privileges and highlights of my pastoral ministry. And that is not an understatement. If you ask me to list the most special things about the time that the Lord has given me to serve as pastor, I would tell you about getting to baptize Coleman. I'd tell you about the joy of getting to do a couple weddings for close loved ones. But that conversation with Rebecca would 100% make the list. Why should you apply this and practice these things? Because it really does make life sweet. In the same way that judgment and condemnation create disharmony and strife, you know what really builds sweet unity? Giving good measures, pressed down, shaken together, and running over. The blind leading the blind leads to death. But disciples being made more merciful like their teacher so that they can lead other disciples well, that's life-giving. There are few things more cringeworthy than a hypocrite with no self-awareness hiding his own glaring faults by pointing that out in others. But there are few things more praiseworthy than a group of brothers and sisters humbly asking for help to see their own errors so that they might be freed up to help each other. The Lord is the giver of all things. He measures out judgments to you. He measures out judgments to your brothers. He measures out judgments to your enemies. Therefore, Jesus says last week, don't spend your time trying to usurp the role of God and judge your enemies. God will do that. Now he adds, and don't ignore how the Lord might deal with you because you'd rather think about how he might deal with your brother. If you really care about your brother and what he might receive from the Lord, as you should, then see to your own repentance and obedience so that you might actually be a real help to your brother. Ignoring your own sin and fixating on others is the work of hypocrisy. Ignoring the sin of others and only worrying about your own is the work of selfishness and sloth. Friends, let us set ourselves to the long work, to the hard work, to the work of mercy. First addressing our own sin so that we can see clearly to help one another. Let's pray.